Andrew Neil went viral with an impassioned eulogy which, like most eulogies, was just inaccurate nonsense in the form of nice memorable words strung together with angry sad words. A speech which would have made those named within it proud, but only because a good few of them were nihilistic absurdists. To list the great French thinkers in a tribute to nuclear might showcased the worst aspect of historical fame. These were figures Neil could name but knew nothing about. For a list supporting the French government's foray into bombing its former colony, he chose Satie, a composer so questioning of state he put a question mark into La Marseillaise. Zola, a man so adamant about the function of a fair and full trial he was murdered for his beliefs. Rousseau, those who think themselves masters of others are greater slaves than they. Ravel, who rejected all state honours. Gauguin, a passionate defender of indigenous peoples. And Camus, the great Algerian-born philosopher who died in 1960, just a year before he would have been thrown into the Seine at the orders of the Nazi head of the Parisian police. Out of his list of peacenik, thoughtful, anti-government icons, one of the few who might have been in favour of bombing Syria was Sartre, and that's only because he thought we were all dead anyway. Of course, we mustn't forget Coco Chanel, who Andrew threw onto the list in such a blatant, if we don't include a woman we'll get into trouble rush, he didn't notice a quick wiki would reveal her to be a Nazi spy. These are the people who made France great, because what they asked of France was to question, to look death in the eye, to commit to full trials and never resort to military force, to step away from government, away from indigenous lands, to never see themselves as superior, and most of all, for people to stop regurgitating rhetorical cliches and think for themselves. Neil asked us to consider who will be remembered in 1,000 years, and the answer, of course, is Tzikelsrd, the insane cockroach emperor who revolutionised the mining of our bodies for fuel. But let's go with his conceit. 1,000 years is a long time. The first book published in France wasn't until 1470. Goodness knows what an Islamic caliphate would have been doing 1,000 years ago. They built the House of Wisdom in Baghdad, the first university in the world. They asked scholars of all faiths to translate every text ever written into Arabic. They also demanded the first qualifications for doctors, founded the first mental hospitals, invented ophthalmology, they developed algebra, algorithms are named after their Arab father, and a programmable machine, a computer. They introduced Aristotle to Europe. Al-Jahiz began theories of natural selection. They discovered the Andromeda galaxy, classified the spinal nerves, and created hydropower using pumps and gears. And Neil is right. We don't remember any of that. Not to say this is what ISIS want. ISIS are like the group that closed the House of Wisdom, the next caliphate, who decided science was irreligious. ISIS want to destroy the knowledge that Islam is a beautiful, scientific, and intelligent culture, and we are way ahead of them. We want Paris to be remembered in 1,000 years, and we don't remember the names of the victims 10 minutes after reading them. We don't remember Amine Ibn al-Mubarak, a Moroccan emigre who was designing an architectural solution to the 2,000 deaths at Mecca. We don't remember Elsa Del Plas and her mother, Patricia San Martin, who died shielding Elsa's young son from bullets. We remember that the suicide bomber was blonde, and one of the terrorists had no pants on. We remember that the terrorists came in with refugees even though they don't seem to have done, especially since they were all French or Belgian. We expect our descendants to remember Daft Punk, and we don't even remember that invading Iraq caused the birth and rise of ISIS. And we won't remember any of this once the new series of Britain's Got Talent starts. In which the listener is asked to consider the environment. December 2015. It seems odd to hold a climate change conference at a time of year when everyone has just looked out of their window and notched the thermostat up by 2 degrees. Change seems such a mild word for what's going on. When we say that someone has changed, we usually mean that they're drinking a bit more or less. We don't mean that they're lying stone dead under 5 miles of ocean on a rock that now hangs silently forever in the freezing vault of space. An initiative was announced for a network of 120 countries to form a solar power grid, but I don't think Scotland qualified. I'm not sure how much solar energy we produce. All I know is it's way less than it takes to light a sky. Clean energy is always described as expensive and inefficient, but I suppose that if the price of the alternatives is extinction, we might just be measuring expense and efficiency wrongly. The Pope has said that Earth is nearing an environmental suicide. Many leaders will question his right to speak on climate change, but to be fair, he's the only one driving about in an electric van. Developing nations say that rich Western countries aren't doing enough to help them deal with the effects of climate change, but that's not the case. We're going to help them deal with drought by submerging them under the ocean. As the temperature increases, some people say it will be like boiling a frog, but surely in that analogy the frog doesn't know that the temperature is rising. Humanity is fully aware, but possibly just too depressed to do anything. It's more like boiling a recently divorced 45-year-old man. There could be a plus side to the ice caps melting. Think of the interesting things you find when you just defrost your freezer. We could discover the first entirely breadcrumbed mammoth. Pointing out that the Earth is our home doesn't seem to help. After all, a lot of us have got a room in our house that we gradually fill up with crap and can't bear to go into. I suppose that's just the developing world. There's going to be a big rise in demand for electricity in the developing world. I guess spending 14 hours a day assembling our consumer goods was bound to put ideas in their heads. Many of you will be reading this on a tablet made by a Chinese teenager using rare metals that an African child has scraped off the side of a hill with a spoon, then sent halfway round the world to you so that you can smugly talk about how little paper you use. Recently, Richard Branson signed an Earth statement, the same week he launched a new Boeing. I would say, how can he keep a straight face? But his face has never been entirely straight. He looks like someone cast a baboon in a movie about Rolf Harris. Maybe it's time we started looking at being pro-business and pro-environment as opposites. They might pay someone to smile at the front desk, but corporations don't care if we live or die. Perhaps it's time to look at insentient blueprints for making money and wonder if they really have people's best interests at heart. Can the market, a mechanism dedicated to increasing consumption, tackle a problem that is essentially down to excessive consumption? Why not? I mean, after all, we've all been down an actual market and heard those cries of, "Strawberries! Don't buy these strawberries! You don't really need them! You'll throw most of them away and they go mouldy after you forget to eat them! Don't buy these strawberries!" Things will be terrible for the people who come after us. And they weren't that great for the people who came before us either, as it was 2 degrees colder and there was no telly. Perhaps we're all annoyed at climate change deniers because we know that the Earth is past the point of no return. We're frustrated that they're still at the denial stage of grief, while we have moved on to bargaining. Things are so desperate that even our fictional dystopias may turn out to be fantasies. We imagine the Earth will sink gradually into chaos, but non-linear theories of global warming mean it might just be one afternoon of people screaming, then suddenly you disappear under a boiling 100-mile-high wave of sewage flecked with famous landmarks from across the world. Your mind finally silenced by the sudden arrival in the space previously occupied by your forehead of a shit-coloured Taj Mahal. In your final moments, you will probably feel cheated out of the many years you had hoped to spend watching a naked king in a leather crown as he staged mass hangings of poets in the echoing vaults of abandoned shopping malls. I dropped in to see my friend the other day, and her 4-year-old daughter opened with, "The world is dying," in a very sad voice. I said something soothing. I wish I could remember what it was now. Soon she'll learn that, outside of the occasional Illuminati photo opportunity like Paris, it's not really the sort of thing we find polite to talk about. Where the listener is invited to remember when we decided to bomb Syria and to reflect on whether this has helped. December 2015. So we decided to stop children drowning on the beaches by killing them in their beds. It's hard to think of a more poetic metaphor for our utter lack of ideas than spending several years dropping high explosives onto a desert. Dropping something from a great height can never be precise. This is why Santa still parks up the sleigh. I have to admit that I was sort of disturbed by the palpable excitement in Parliament and couldn't escape the feeling that our politicians like wars because they make them feel important. The motion they voted on was a vague list of necessary measures and requests for assistance, with a specifically airstrikes at the very bottom. Like someone had shouted it out the front door as they were starting the car. "Oh, don't forget eggs, milk and airstrikes." One MP argued that IS needs a lot of space to move and airstrikes would limit their territory. The parachuters lived in one room with a mattress. We could bomb Syria to the average size of a London flat and they'd still find room to manoeuvre. Bombing Syria will achieve nothing. Let's at least take a swing at China and have these dull winter skies replaced with a curtain of incendiary light. What is Cameron's problem with ISIS? Ordinary people who in their spare time have formed a huge multinational oil trade and a workforce of thousands willing to be paid in rice and fear. That's the big society right there. Cameron called them women-raping, Muslim-murdering, medieval monsters. He carefully avoided saying child molesters, in case one of the backbench shouted, "Present!" This is before we get to the fact that he used the word medieval to justify a military expedition into the Middle East. Of course, bombing will cause delight in Islamic State, where it will form the only entertainment. There's no music, no dancing, and we're spending a couple of million quid at night providing the mise-en-scène for these sadists' fantasy life. Hilary Benn, the product of his father's tempestuous affair with Lembit Opek, showed a fighting spirit that was a direct proof of the song A Boy Named Sue. I think it's worth remembering that if you say something and Tories start cheering, then you have said something awful. Yes, Hilary, we bombed Hitler, but we were being attacked here by German planes that were leaving from Germany, not by a teenager in West London who'd been assembling a doodlebug in the garage. Benn's whole speech was played in celebratory fashion the next night on Radio 4, feeding into my theory that George Orwell was so prescient about our society that he moved to Jura to deliberately encourage his TB. We learned little from the debate, except for the fact that the word caliphate sounds hilarious in a Northern Irish accent, and so do a bunch of other words. Perhaps we'll soon be so used to the Middle East being in permanent conflict that retaking a Syrian village from ISIS will become one of the tasks in The Apprentice. Perhaps destruction is simply easier than kindness. We find it easier to tell a stranger on WhatsApp we want to have sex with their face than hold hands with someone we might be falling in love with. It's ridiculous, really. Charles Manson or Anders Breivik murder people to try to start a race war, and it's laughably insane. But when ISIS do it, we decide to give them one. Islamic State practice a brand of Islamic law so strict that apparently Raqqa only has 2 Irish pubs. For some reason, the BBC website keeps reporting opposing moderate rebel groups, but never names them. I know the names of all the cat hybrid vegetable marine biologist octonauts, but the differences between the groups fighting Assad are deemed too complex for me. Moderate seems to be a very fluid term when it comes to offshoots of Al-Qaeda and whatnot, and moderate groups vary from outfits like Nuclear Holocaust, who despise the West, and more reasonable elements like Al-Jihadi Infidel Soul Harvest, who despise the East, because if you travel east for long enough, you reach the West. I wonder if the Commons really understands, or cares, that they are making Britain a target. How affected will MPs be by terrorism? In their high security lives, the only fear they have of an attack on a bus is that the waiters will be late for a drinks reception. I think we live in a country that sometimes forgets how effective the rule of law is, perhaps because our governments have often found it inconvenient. We invest a vast amount of money in intelligence, and terrorists have by their nature to take risks, cross borders, move weapons. I think the most effective place for those guys to end up is not in a martyr video, but in a small but comfortable jail cell. Somewhere in Kent, perhaps. No paradise, no virgins, no meaning lent by us to their stupidity, no glory, no attention. Just a guard wishing them a bland good morning and a regular change of towels. And if you think that's insufficient punishment, give them a television that only gets terrestrial and all our newspapers every day. Being a lecture which the author delivered at an event the rapper Akala was holding at the Royal Festival Theatre in December 2015. The author wishes to give a shout out to Akala and to the UK grime scene more generally. I've never given a lecture before, so let me apologise in advance. I'll be talking about things which some of you will know more about than me. I'll touch on struggles that are not my own, and I'll definitely get some of this wrong. I had second thoughts about doing this. Guys with beards telling everybody how it is probably what got the world into this mess in the first place. And then I was listening to Nas's One Time for the Mind the other day, and I thought, let's do One Time for the Mind, son. I thought, let's talk about where the British mind is at and how it got there. Let's talk about the reality tunnel that we live in today. And let's talk about the idea of whether it's possible for people like me, by which I mean privileged, white, rich arseholes, to live moral lives. Just a year ago, I don't think I would have felt confident giving my genuine opinion on anything. But now I know the time got an older mind. We all live in our own reality tunnel, seeing things through the prism of our own prejudice and expectations. Look at Star Trek. To us, the Federation seems benign, travelling the galaxy in a quest for knowledge. Wait a minute though, some planets are just holiday worlds. Did they choose that? Or did the Federation tell them that suddenly their whole planet was going to be washing beach towels and handing out cocktails? Is that what the USS Enterprise is flying about the galaxy looking for? New sex worlds? Perhaps the formal name is Holiday World, but of course they're actually sex worlds. If we take the Enterprise as being representative of the Federation, it seems to have three approaches when it discovers new alien life. Fuck it, stun it, or kill it. And hold up, that ship they fly about in seems to be pretty much a giant floating gun. That's not good, is it? Often, they are so keen to shoot something as powerfully as possible that they divert energy from their life support systems to the gun. Yet we see them as being altruistic, floating about in the USS Peace Gun, looking for places to go on holiday. I'd imagine the Federation looks quite different if you're living on an undiscovered world with a lot of beaches. And maybe Star Trek looks different if you're living in South America and you have a history of explorers being the first stage of colonising invasions. Does that sound stupid to you? That's because I'm from a different reality tunnel. One where I wander around thinking about the ideology of Star Trek when I'm supposed to be writing a lecture. So what is Britain's reality tunnel? I think the key to understanding Britain and America are that they view themselves as exceptional, as being an exception even to things like international law and the rules of war. American exceptionalism comes from the fact that it developed its imperial tendencies in the era of modern warfare, or possibly because it only exists because it perpetrated genocide against its own indigenous inhabitants. It could roughly be expressed as, we alone have a moral right to use force. Britain's exceptionalism is similar, but slightly more colonial in tone. I think it can be summarised as, we are civilised, and other people are not. As a kid, I used to love a big book in our local library called Civilization. I think I thought, aged about 12 or 13, that if I read it all I would be civilised. It was the book of the landmark BBC series from the late 1960s by Kenneth Clarke. It's most famous now, I suppose, for having focused entirely on Western civilization, as if nothing else mattered. In the book, Clarke comes across as an intelligent man with an empathy for other cultures. At one point, he even muses that the British Museum, for us a sign of civilization, would have looked as threatening to other cultures as the periscope of a nuclear submarine. Nonetheless, what is truly remarkable about the book is civilization is never defined. It doesn't have to be. It is self-evident that what is civilized is us, in the Western tradition. The book starts with a comparison of a bust of Apollo and an African mask. He writes of the bust, whatever its merits as a work of art, I don't think there's any doubt that it embodies a higher state of civilization than the mask. They both represent spirits, messengers from another world, that is to say, from a world of our own imagining. To the Negro imagination, it is a world of fear and darkness, ready to inflict horrible punishment for the smallest infringement of a taboo. To the Hellenistic imagination, it is a world of light and confidence, in which gods are like ourselves, only more beautiful, and descend to earth to teach men reason and the laws of harmony. And that is the reality tunnel of this culture. We are civilized and others are not. Indeed, we believe our imaginations are more civilized than those of others, and that we create art and culture which is a reflection of ourselves and our desire to promote reason and harmony. If you can't find those ideas in our culture today, just stop me afterwards and I'll be happy to point them out to you in today's paper, where they will form the basis of most of the reporting of our latest foreign military adventures. So how is our reality tunnel constructed? Obviously the media is key. The BBC continues to project homogeneity onto an increasingly divided and unequal society. Even the names of the programmes, The One Show, The Great British Bake Off, suggest trying to push conformity at an increasingly diverse audience, many of whom understand BBC purely as a porn term. There's a horrifying lack of diversity. A recent report said that only 1.5% of programmes on British TV last year had a black, Asian or minority ethnic director. But then how could there be diversity How could you continue to push the idea of homogeneity if there was diversity? How could you continue to say, we are civilised and other people are not, if you had to produce a fair quota of programmes that reflected multicultural British experience, when some of those people's experiences involve Britain blowing up their grandparents? I'm being facetious, but I honestly wonder if the lack of diversity in broadcasting isn't at least partly conscious. It's not like there aren't writers and actors and filmmakers from minorities submitting their stories. It's that the broadcasters have for decades literally, and I mean literally, it's important that we understand this, had meetings with those people, sometimes commissioned treatments and pilots from them, and then taken those scripts and thrown them into a furnace. So a lot of our media tends to be produced by a small, homogenous, often painfully middle-class group of people. The general attitude to people outside of the Oxbridge bubble isn't intolerance exactly. Sure, there's a certain air of smiling through gritted teeth as people from the local housing estate turn up at the village fete, but really it's just an overwhelming lack of interest. That expression on their faces when you're pitching your E14 set cop drama, crime scene investigators, is the same one Prince Philip wears when he's forced to watch a Maori war dance. England is a hugely parochial country, where nobody speaks any languages. Anyone who doubts any of this should go see Who's Cleaning Broadcasting House, where race relations seem to have been closely modelled on Gone with the Wind. Scotland, naturally, raises a couple of £100 million of licence fee a year that isn't spent in Scotland, subsidising the stories, music and humour of other people whose lives, we're left to assume, are somehow more valuable and meaningful. And what is the culture that is produced by our media? Well, at the moment, entertainment must have the blandest, most soothing tone possible. The average evening's television is baking, pottery, ballroom dancing, like the occupational therapy programme of someone who has suffered a horrendous mental breakdown. And that's because people are going to need it to recover from the face-clawing, fear-mongering hysteria of the news. The Batman villain, the Scarecrow, produces a fear gas that gives his victims terrifying hallucinations. I was laughing with my kid the other day, saying the Batman got hit with the fear gas on an early mission, and everything else is just the effect of the gas on him. The larger-than-life villains are just local teenagers getting beaten to a pulp by this madman. He probably doesn't even put his costume on. The Joker is just some children's entertainer who gets regularly victimised during his flashbacks, and the Penguin is a local pigeon. Really, we've all had a blast of the fear gas. If you see a Muslim on a plane and think terrorist, that's a delusion. People walk about thinking they're going to be mugged or raped. Do you know why? They're pumping us full of fear gas, man, and it gets into the house through your TV. That's why in the Western world, in these times of plenty and no real threats, we're governed by stress, the hormonal response to danger and famine. The question of how racism informed slavery and slavery was informed by racism is a complex one, which I'm happy to leave to people who know more. But there was one often downplayed element to slavery and colonialism. It was driven by greed. Indeed, the Caribbean slave trade might encapsulate the whole sordid thing, as it was largely for sugar production, and many suffered for something that nobody actually needed. Colonialism was for profit. India was first colonised by a private company. Post-war, the US was a superpower unlike any the earth has ever seen. It encouraged European countries in their colonial endeavours because of something called the dollar gap. America was producing so many manufactured goods that countries like France and Britain didn't have enough dollars to pay for them. So France was encouraged to plunder Indochina, and Britain held on to Malaya for similar reasons. So the subjugation of whole societies and the theft of their resources was a simple matter of accounting and explicitly involved with consumerism. This is what we are built on, and it is permitted by the maxim, we are civilised and you are not. Britain is so far from dealing with the reality of colonialism that the Raj still regularly forms a backdrop for romantic dramas. Our whole society is founded on ideas of economic growth. If you borrow money at a rate of interest, you will need to grow the investment to pay back the principal plus the interest and retain a profit. So Britain has always needed to grow, even when the resources they needed to grow had other people living on top of them. We're a society where everybody is expected to be trying to get rich, no matter how futile the attempt. And despite the fact that we know something that we learn from every magazine and hip-hop song, something we've known since we listened to fairy tales as kids, rich people aren't happy. The reason rich people are so unhappy is that luxury is only designed to be aspired to. It's part of the sales pitch of capitalism, the advert. You're not supposed to actually have it, any more than you're supposed to eat the picture of a hamburger off a menu. Take that holiday brochure in which a waiter serves a couple a romantic meal on a beach. In reality, your chair leg would sort of sink into the sand at some kind of odd angle. You'd have to shift your weight in the other direction to try to counter it. The table would sink into the sand too, altering its angle every time you pressed your fork down onto the plate. You would be dimly aware of being annoyed that you could see your waiter smoking under a palm tree between courses. Later he would startle you by laughing explosively with a passing member of staff, and you would vaguely wonder if they were talking about you. There would be little flies everywhere, but they wouldn't spoil the food, because all the food would taste of sand. It's an illness, really, the pursuit of wealth. Beyond a certain point, money is useless. A pair of diamond-encrusted high heels costing £276,000 are the most expensive shoes in the world. If you encrust anything with enough diamonds, it can be the world's most expensive. Stick a £50 note in dog shit and you've got a world record. Only the very rich and the very poor can boast about the sheer act of having bought a thing. For the middle classes, it's all about connoisseurship. You can't boast about your spending power, so instead it's about your taste, as you burrow deeper and deeper into the marketed life. Connoisseurship is what used to be boasted of by merchants. Look at the lovely stuff I've gathered to sell. We're still merchants, but now we're selling the idea of ourselves. And of course, our personal taste is largely meaningless, but it's all we've got, so we give it the force of moral judgment. I live in a nuclear-armed state that has spent centuries looting the world. I pay taxes that buy bombs, aircraft carriers, fissile material. Can I really be a moral being just because I don't like dapper laughs? I have taste. I don't do what mainstream culture tells me to. I buy independent comics and conscious hip-hop. But how can I buy my way out of problems intrinsically linked with consumption? You can take it further. Am I really a better person if I don't use discriminatory language, but I have little to do with the groups that language discriminates against? Am I not just drawing a circle around myself and my friends and saying, we are the good people? Am I not just repurposing our culture's defining myth? We are civilized and you are not. An ethical consumer is still just a consumer. We're all beautiful individual little snowflakes, but it's all just snow. I remember as a kid scouring those little brochures you'd get from Woolworths for my parents' Christmas presents. Like you, I moved on to express myself through the charities I supported, the bands I was into, even the people I hung around with. Around me grew a society where people would turn up for the half hour of adverts before a film and never complain. Where we tried to express our individuality through the purchase of mass-produced goods. Even my favourite comedian, Bill Hicks, was peddling that individuality through smoking thing. That was just an angle thought up by ad men decades earlier. People started to speak of the ads being better than the TV shows, somehow believing against all the evidence that the TV shows were the principal content and the adverts incidental. We have a bit of a hangover from earlier times. People think of themselves as a self, a conscious being. In late capitalism, the self is no longer the ego. It is our brand identity. Most of what we do is not to serve our ego, our own idea of ourselves, but actually to serve our status, other people's idea of ourselves. We're the first completely market-orientated generation in history, and it has destroyed our ability to be free and conscious. We're not the people we pretend to be. If I invented a time machine, I'd like to think my first trip would be to go back and kill Hitler. In reality, I'd use the first trip to go and kill Piers Morgan's mother at the moment of his conception, and the second one to go back and check. I've always felt ambivalent about psychoanalysis. I've thought of going into therapy, but I know it'd be like hiring a window cleaner for a burning building. It says a lot about our society, that we feel our daddy not playing with us enough might explain our whole personality, but people whose countries were destroyed by our troops, or later our corporations, should just get over it. When talking about our relationships, we can admit it's complicated, while we feel intractable international problems can be solved with a bit of simple bombing. But perhaps we could look at Britain as a therapist might look at it. It lacks the desire to address its problems, that's a starting point. It lives in denial about its past. It's paranoid about its own people. It's prone to lash out. It's in a pretty bad place. I was an alcoholic once, a long time ago. Sometimes strangers come up to me and ask me how I stopped drinking. Sometimes they admit they have a problem themselves. And recovery is always a lot of little steps, so I try to suggest something minor to them. Going and talking to someone about it, even just a friend, admitting they're in trouble maybe. Any little practical thing I can achieve in a short conversation. What I actually feel like saying to them is just too large. I want to tell them that I was there and I couldn't see anything else either. I was trapped in an addiction that meant I couldn't enjoy the moment. I couldn't see any way out. And now I spend a lot of days sitting in a park listening to great hip-hop records and writing jokes. I spend whole days just writing jokes to tell my kids when they get out of school. Sometimes they don't laugh at any of them, but it's still good. I want to tell those people, when I meet them, that there is a place beyond this, that they just can't see it from when they're standing. And as a country, there's a place beyond this. The suffering caused by the modern British mindset are just the problems created by any troubled mind. We could just try to come to terms with our shame over our history, and move on. The payment of reparations for the colonial past will feel like a relief when it comes. It might even be fun. I thought when Glasgow hosted the Commonwealth Games how great it would have been if we'd used the opening ceremony to rename the places that are named after the slave trade, Jamaica Street, the Kingston Bridge. We should have handed over the profits from the games at the opening ceremony, while the proclaimers sang a terrible version of Redemption Song. There is a place beyond this, I think. Because problems are presented as insoluble doesn't mean that they are. We could probably treat every wounded soldier from the last decade of war for the cost of the first missile we drop on Syria. We could change our institutions so they helped us grow rather than imprisoned us. Poverty, whether physical, intellectual or spiritual, is man-made, and we can unmake it. I think we could start by trying to change our founding principle from "we are civilized and other people are not" to "there is a place beyond this, and it's going to be beautiful." Part 3. So are we heading for a Mad Max-style future? No. After having lived through Donald Trump, we'll surely just call him Max. This section covers the United States from 2015 to 2017, stretching from before they decided to elect a president with the temperament of a wasp that spent 40 minutes on musical hold, right up to the FBI investigation that meant he was suddenly at war with intelligence in 2 ways. Can we even think of Trump in terms of intent? Aren't we then like those shamans who used to project anger onto erupting volcanoes? His Twitter feed reads like he's building up a credible insanity defence for when he's finally impeached. It's not just that he lives on Twitter, he embodies it. Digressive, petty, trivial, poisonous and self-aggrandising. He basically speaks like a totally random stream of tweets. 1 minute he's on Mexicans, then he's talking about shoes, then a threat, then a joke about a cat. Maybe Trump is a kind of cry for help from the earth, a human flare. Or Trump may have been produced by the earth to destroy mankind, and his personality is actually nature's critique of humanity. The US has always been balanced on uneasy contradictions. Even the Constitution promises both the right to freedom of speech and the freedom to have a gun to shoot people who annoy you. Right at the heart of its contradictions are the twin ideas of liberty and enslavement, its founding principles of freedom and "but not for everybody." I think the US will now face a struggle to avoid a slide towards totalitarianism, led of course by people calling themselves libertarians. Worryingly, as this happens, I doubt it will matter that the US has a rhetorical attachment to democracy. Through its actions as a state, it has long undermined any connection between its stated ideals and its actions. In which the listener is asked to consider foreign policy and its consequences, which contains a joke about Bobby Moore that The Guardian didn't understand, but which the author has included here for a bit of a laugh. June 2015. I suppose that whether this article, prompted by the Charleston shootings, feels topical enough will depend on whether America has had another mass shooting before it goes to print. If you're reading in the US, there's a fair chance it will seem dated because you are actually being gunned down as you read it. So I'll try to get straight to the point. It's surely worth wondering whether it's time to retire the flag that has for so long been a rallying point for racists and murderers, the Stars and Stripes. There's a genuine question to be asked here. What responsibility does the US state bear for the Charleston shootings when racist murder seems to be part of its policing strategy and most of its foreign policy? Occasionally I wonder whether at some point in the last 100 years the US gave the rest of the world a safe word and we've simply forgotten it. Or maybe we're just pronouncing it wrong. Aluminium? I thought you said it was aluminium. Hillary Clinton has been speaking out against the racist terrorism of Dylan Roof, despite being the architect of the US military intervention in Libya. The US's record of invasions, assassinations, and government overthrows is racist, I think. Imagining that you can kill people and seize control of their resources without believing them to be inferior requires a certain amount of intellectual flexibility. The same sort of intellectual flexibility that allows people to express grief for the migrants who drown in the Mediterranean and hatred for the ones who survive. Part of the whole American mindset comes from the fact that the USA was formed through the racist murder of indigenous people. The reason the whole country is such a horror story is that the entire thing is built on an old Indian graveyard. I worry that perhaps white America wants to believe that its racial fault lines only run as deep as the Confederate flag, hence the current uproar at names of Southern Civil War generals being on street signs while the faces of slave owners are still in the currency. Of course, not everybody gets behind America's view of itself, which is why it's the world's largest producer of propaganda. Last year's biggest movie, American Sniper, was billed as the story of the US Army's deadliest soldier, which must have felt pretty galling for the guy who dropped the bomb on Hiroshima. It was basically Star Wars from the point of view of one of the stormtroopers, and the director, Clint Eastwood, I'm not even joking, encouraged us to get behind the idea that you should take moral decisions when women and children are in your crosshairs rather than long, long before. You got the feeling that the clunky scene explaining that Sniper Chris Kyle's unit painted skulls on their gear as a tribute to the Punisher was necessary in case viewers made the more logical supposition that it was a tribute to the Waffen-SS. There are many indicators of advanced civilizations, but unthinking hero worship of their military isn't one of them. The US, like the UK, has been forced to move away from a conscription army and now has a mercenary army. It's the reason you don't get war poets anymore. Indeed, before Britain feels too superior, we should perhaps remember that Dylan Roof's main problem here would have been feeling torn between quite a few of the main parties at the last election. We live in a country where posting, "Let's riot or something, bruv," on Facebook will get you a couple of years in prison, or writing a column saying we should bomb Syria is practically an entrance exam for public intellectuals. Of course, it's never phrased as a plea to kill shepherds in pursuit of our geopolitical interests. By the time it hits the broadsheets, it's a plea to arm moderate rebels. They've got a moderate vision of their country's future, and they're going to kill until they get it. It's a humanitarian intervention. We're not fighting wars for control of resources, we're just defending Iraq from the Iraqis. The most obvious anti-war argument, that none of this has ever worked, just doesn't seem to come up. Britain will ally itself with the most brutal tyrannies it can find if it thinks there might be a few quid in it. England will even turn up to the Qatar World Cup, despite the fact that if Qatar had hosted the tournament in 1970, Bobby Moore would have had his hands cut off. Of course, our governments are just trying to protect us from terror, in the same way that someone banging a hornet's nest with a stick is trying to protect us from hornets. Maybe I'll even give them the benefit of the doubt and concede that they are just naive do-gooders trying to bring world peace and stability through the medium of explosives. What gets me is that the new dirty word in the West is radicalisation, as if radical change wasn't obviously needed, as if the status quo has any decency or is even survivable. It's not actually difficult to see solutions to the US's problems. Children can do it, until we educate them out of it. Internationally, I propose the radical step of not trying to solve complex political problems with £1,000 bombs. Domestically, I propose they start addressing inequality by paying reparations for slavery. I'm well aware that in a society where war and discrimination are now almost entirely normalised, both options sound like madness. Here, the author considers the run-up to the final American election, November 2015. The absurdly long run-up to the US election has begun. This will be the first election fought under new rules, where there are no limits to campaign donations, a change brought in on the grounds of free speech, when the Supreme Court decided that the Koch brothers not being able to say, "We own the president," infringed their rights under the First Amendment. Personally, I think Obama will be quite lonely once it's all over, not least because he has allowed the police to kill most of the other black people. Differences between the candidates are usually so slight that what the Democratic frontrunner thinks is pretty much just what the Republican frontrunner thinks on the days that he remembers to take his meds. But in something of a format twist, Bernie Sanders, an old-school socialist, has crowdfunded himself into a credible position for the Democratic nomination. I sincerely hope he wins, if only so that we see the first inauguration speech made from inside a giant bulletproof hamster ball. The Democratic frontrunner is Hillary Clinton, a ruthless steel-haired troll doll. Hers is the face that would haunt a lot of Libyans' nightmares if they were still alive. Unfortunately for her election prospects, Hillary has never quite learned to introduce humour or compassion into her speaking voice, and on a good day sounds like an android trying to trick the last human out of a bunker. At last week's Republican debate, the candidates accused CNBC of displaying liberal bias. One reading would be that GOP candidates are now so right-wing they make a giant media conglomerate look liberal. Let's not forget that the essential message of a Republican candidate is a tricky sell. That you love America, but hate all the groups that make up America. That you love democracy, but hate people. Donald Trump, who at best looks like a plug hole in an orangutan sanctuary, is probably only running for president because this dimension doesn't have a Superman he can give a hard time. His hair, looking like a slovenly post-coital cat, is actually one of the least weird things about him. Lacking charm or wit and almost ferociously inarticulate, the US public has identified with him strongly. It seems that the electorate, possibly bored with rational thought, is toying with the idea of cutting out the middleman and just electing one of the business class through sheer force of Stockholm Syndrome. The old politics is dull, and what could be more exciting than electing a man who might declare war on the sea? His plans to build a giant wall sealing the US border with Mexico are interesting, as it would be entertaining to see a nation as heavily armed as America go into cocaine withdrawal. Somehow I always imagine that Trump spends the evenings with his forehead pressed against the cold glass of an aquarium, talking telepathically to the tormented albino squid in which he has hidden his soul. Indeed, the whole Republican field offers a bracing challenge to conventional notions of sanity. The current poll leader is Ben Carson, a neurosurgeon who happens to be a Seventh-day Adventist and creationist. Creationists have often made me doubt evolution, but probably not in the way they think. His taxation policy is based on biblical tithing, taking economic pointers from people who had a GDP of one golden calf. Why do both parties rage against bias in what is actually a laughably servile media? Maybe it's because the political class have an instinctive contempt for asking the public to decide anything meaningful like policy, so their campaigns have to be largely symbolic affairs about hope or hard work or whatever flavour of horseshit is polling well. Most campaign spending goes on advertising. 65% of Obama's grassroots campaign of 2012 was media spend, and advertising speaks in symbolism. Thus the parties may actually distrust any kind of rational inquiry, as what they're saying doesn't and can't make any sense. Or maybe the reality of what they're voting on is something nobody dares express. They're voting on the exact speed of the drift toward a future of armies run by corporations, corralling permanently travelling communities of cooks, cleaners and sex workers as they underbid each other outside the entrances to gated communities to ensure they're the ones let inside to service the fortunate. A future where the pursuit of happiness will make about as much sense as mounting an expedition to reach the horizon. Of course, it could be that the whole election is a bit like the X Factor, and they put a few lunatics in the early rounds to lure us into something we promised we'd never engage with again. By the end, we'll be back to two corporate glove puppets belting out the same tired standards. And no matter how bad the choice is, we'll always have a preference. Clinton will be offering an expanded kill list of official enemies, secret corporate courts, and her first speech about Palestine will sound like it was written by the Hulk. A lot of otherwise rational minds will be praying for her to win. In which the listener is asked to begin to consider Donald Trump, an actual character from the party at the start of Die Hard. April 2016. In this tumultuous US election, there seems for once to be a genuine choice on offer about which kind of ideas will spend 4 years being thwarted in a congressional logjam. This year's race has already spawned thousands of newspaper articles and even a book of revelations. It's actually hard to find a clip of Donald Trump's campaign that doesn't look like a Robocop insert. Then again, saying that a US election is particularly ridiculous is a bit like saying that the only way is Essex has jumped the shark. Unfortunately, even the most horrified coverage of this depraved contest assumes that it's the election that's the problem and not the society that produces it. American elections are traditionally held on a Tuesday. This is because it allowed people to worship on a Sunday, go to the town hall on Monday, vote on Tuesday, and leave Wednesday clear for market. In Britain, we have elections on a Thursday because everyone was too pissed on a Friday. American elections always seem incredibly complicated to us, which is probably a bit rich when we're about to have a nationwide referendum on Europe to decide who's going to be running the Tory party. One feature of this election is the way that the elite of the Republican Party seem to have become completely estranged from their own electorate. Of course, they always worked against the interests of their voters, but they did used to at least understand who they were and what they wanted. With almost infinite resources, the closest they've got to producing a popular candidate is Ted Cruz, a cross between a permanently disappointed sitcom vampire and the high school yearbook photo of every serial killer of the modern era. The Republicans seem to be shocked that the result of decades of polarising rhetoric is a polarised society. The Conservative establishment has spoken in a language of constant crisis, despite being ridiculously well served by the status quo, and it's surprising how well the fear campaign has worked, considering that most of the country is on anti-anxiety medication. Conservatives have focused on false crises of international terror and immigration, little recognising that many voters have been equating that narrative with their own real crises of unemployment, debt and foreclosure. Donald Trump has simply cast himself as a solution. Trump is in many ways just saying what the other candidates would say on cocaine, but he's also a unity candidate. His hope is to bring all of America together in their rejection of reality. Trump divides his time between working some kind of King Ralph angle and claiming that he's going to make the US great again by using his business experience. We can only assume that means repeatedly declaring it bankrupt, then changing its name so he can just shake off all the debt. Trump's one liberal policy seems to be his desire to pump more funding into mental health, which I've taken the liberty of interpreting as a massive cry for help. You can actually make your own Trump policies by going through the incinerator at the Daily Mail and picking through the dust for anything they thought might get them prosecuted. His position on climate change is, how can there be global warming when it's still so cold in my soul? For anyone who's ever asked why the US needs to address the issue of reparations for its history of slavery, Donald Trump is why. He is the living embodiment of America's unresolved issues. How on earth can America consider expelling people of a different faith? An appalled England asks of a country created by the people they expelled for having a different faith. If you're small, black, and always felt that you didn't have the confidence to crowd surf, Trump's political rallies must have come as a godsend. God knows who you vote for if you're black in the USA. I guess all the politicians think black people are too preoccupied with videoing the police with their one lowered hand. Interestingly, in Nevada, 45% of Latino voters went for Trump. Perhaps this indicates that people's identities are more sophisticated than the clumsy definitions that political machinery uses to appraise them. Indeed, the very idea of racial groups as homogenous is probably only possible in a racist society. Trump seems to have the emotional range of a Power Rangers villain and the social skills of a teenage minotaur. He looks like a pumpkin having a nervous breakdown, talks like the words are being fired out of his mouth by a tennis ball launcher, and has the general manner of an arrogant televangelist suspected of murder by Columbo. His approach to public speaking? If in doubt, switch to your internal monologue. His core demographic? Possibly men whose holiday destinations would significantly overlap with a list of missing women. Trump is bringing out people who've never voted, people who felt they had no one to speak for them until now, people who throw microwaved beans at the television, and people who go shopping in their pyjamas. And who knows, if Trump supporters are using their 8-fingered fists to make banners and red hats, rather than drunkenly beating their kid into a coma that they won't let a black doctor treat, maybe that's a good thing. Trump knows that he appeals to people who are suspicious not just of political elites, but everything those elites believe in, including rationality, and when confronted with anything empirical, instinctively retreats into unverifiable anecdotes. Trump-Sanders might actually end up being an interesting election, centering on detailed arguments about trade and jobs, and Trump might come off really badly, as those are areas on which he has the firm grasp of a stroke victim eating an eclair. It's certainly been entertaining to watch Sanders try to convey a message of hope through the dark prism of the US's Stage 4 corporate media. Aside from all the obvious problems of inherent bias, he has to energise people by asking them to engage in the passive activity of watching him on television, has to ask for activism and a more sophisticated understanding of political problems through a medium that is all about voyeurism and simplification. It reminds me of when you used to see communists in the city centre on a Saturday, trying to explain Marxism to people while they were out shopping. A Bernie Sanders presidency would certainly be entertaining, not least because at 74, by the end of a second term, he'll think he's Beyoncé. If you want a president who's going to sort out healthcare, the ideal incumbent is someone who's going to be using it a lot, really soon. Then again, if there's one advantage to being the first socialist president of the United States, it's that dying of old age isn't really going to be a big worry. Sanders will be the first Jewish man to run for president, and the Republicans hate everything about Jews, except Israel. It says something about the incredible strength of anti-Semitism that paranoid ideas about Jews controlling the media and banking systems persist even among the people who control the media and banking systems. Hillary Clinton hasn't really had any idea how to deal with Sanders. To continue to calmly explain why someone ahead of you in general election polling is unelectable, and Clinton hates to see a leader being unelectable, unless they're a dictator in some vassal state, suggests that some of her personal stiffness has seeped into what increasingly seems like a detached and inflexible campaign. On the campaign trail, she's a cynical power player, projecting the weary joy of a shopping mall Santa, while inside her burns the fury of Michael Corleone having to do a meet and greet at a farmer's market in Idaho. She seems to shake hands with each member of the public, as if musing on all the things she could do to them if only they were Libyan. I know this all sounds like a lazy swipe at Hillary for being an uncaring android, and of course it is, but there's also a serious point. The sort of presentation strategy that would work best against Trump, a tireless public servant saddened at having to deal with the insults of a reality show star, is probably well out with her abilities as a performer. Also, Trump fares best against candidates who he can paint as opportunistic insiders, subservient to corporate interests, and Clinton can only accentuate those qualities as she pivots to the right to take him on. The sentiment she has to fake in a campaign, joy, relaxation, a desire to reach out to people, are all incredibly difficult for her. Luckily, the palette of emotions we can expect of her presidency, bitter triumph, cynicism and indifference, are well within her range. Hillary will very likely beat Trump decisively because he is even more unpopular with Republicans than she is with Democrats. There's every chance that the conservative donor money will start to flow towards Hillary, who at least knows how to speak very carefully about the things that really matter, like trade deals. Naturally, the White House will look very different from the last time she was there, because she'll throw out all the furniture that her husband fucked people on. At least we'll get the entertainment of watching her trying to destroy ISIS, using the methods by which she helped to create ISIS, turning the Middle East into an endless game of whack-a-mole. For America, and indeed the rest of the world, Clinton versus Trump will be like being on a bus being driven at high speed towards a cliff by a psychopath, where there's a chance that a chimpanzee might grab control of the steering wheel. It's not a question of whether this will make things better or worse. It's more that the whole idea of better may be gradually ceasing to exist. A new piece where the listener is invited to consider the ubiquitousness of surveillance. Ever been to one of those spiritualist shows where they channel people from the other side? The messages are either mundane, like a great auntie telling you that you've got a leaky tap somewhere, or I'm in a better place, I'm at peace now, variations on praising the afterlife. The explanation? All communications leaving heaven are heavily censored. Basically, it's like North Korea, with God a tyrannical despot who'll do anything to stop the truth coming out. That's why ghost sightings are so inconsistent. They get hunted down and dragged back to heaven, Then, as a warning to other potential dissidents, a 9-foot-tall angel forces them through a harp so they come out like human chips. I shudder to think what he's doing to people up there if they all need to sit on fluffy clouds. As above, so below. We live in times of increasingly ubiquitous surveillance. This erosion of privacy is something my girlfriend feels particularly strongly about. And I mean 2 whole pages in her diary strongly. Of course, there are things we can do if we want to stop others spying on our internet activity. Personally, I'm old school and tend to opt for marbles on the stairs. I'm actually glad the government spies on us online. With them wanting less and less involvement in our health and education, it's reassuring to know they're still so interested in our thoughts. Consider the irony of having privacy settings on social media. Next time you set any social media to private, the honest thing would be for a pair of pincers to rise up from the motherboard to chop your fingers off. Some people see social media as a net gain for resistance movements in terms of helping them to bypass conventional media, share information and organise. There's a competing view of it being both a tool of surveillance and an opportunity to use data to manipulate the political process. At first glance, something like Facebook certainly seems depressing. You'd have predicted that given the freedom to say anything, at least some people would be saying, "I always wanted to be a dancer," rather than applauding the death of black people and stating a dislike of seeing women in public spaces. Mark Zuckerberg said that he founded Facebook when he realised that there was nowhere online for people to see pictures of strangers' lunches alongside poisonous anti-Semitic conspiracy theories. The company is now a key part of the social media landscape, where every day we can log on and find that nobody gives a shit about us on several different platforms. Before Facebook came along in 2007, there was nowhere we could pretend to be happy to annoy our exes, or find out that someone we used to go to primary school with is now a racist. The platform is exactly what you'd expect an adolescent, drunk, privileged white male to invent. A device to pipe doubt, anxiety and fear directly into the pocket of every woman on the planet. Facebook uses a special algorithm to make sure that when it suggests people you may know, it always includes one ex-partner, someone who has stalked you since school, and at least a dozen people who you'd cheerfully describe as your sworn mortal enemies. Stalkers groups have complained that social media has taken the thrill out of their hobby and lament the decline of classic skills like the ability to use binoculars one-handed. Indeed, in 2010, my Facebook was taken over by a malicious sex predator when I suddenly remembered my password. Constantly trying to innovate, the company recently put a button right in the middle of its app that shows you stolen goods in your local area. Facebook also plans to enhance its face recognition software to a level where as soon as you look at other people's holiday photos, it will post "bored shitless" without you having to type. But at least it's all for a good cause, so that a blank-eyed sociopath can own 5,000 identical t-shirts like a serial killer. And yet there is a case for saying that social media might be a progressive force. The ways in which it gives a platform to previously marginalised voices is particularly striking in a British context, where the mainstream media is traditionally unrepresentative of race, class and gender. I think it has also cracked the facade of homogeneous certainty that you used to hear in the tone of the mainstream media. The bland assurance that news carried in the recent past seems to me to be slightly ridiculous in the face of our access to unapologetically subjective viewpoints. Think of the passive voice that news has been reported with for most of our adult lives. As bombs fall on Yemen, like they were just rolling out of planes, no agency directing them, as natural as rain. Our political system isn't worried about the internet's potential for data mining, targeted advertising and platforming racists. It sees those things as the future of mainstream politics. The fact that the development of social media is an explosion of new broadcasters and a sudden loss of doctrinal conformity is the real reason that greater regulation isn't far away. The main reason why a relatively free internet has been tolerated so far is that it facilitates atomization. The things that have caused the biggest establishment panics in my lifetime have all involved people physically getting together. Riots, certainly, but also raves. When I was a teenager, the country was seized by a moral panic about New Age travellers. And every night one summer, the evening news would report on the latest movements of some goths in a van. I think our establishment will tolerate people feeling connected online so long as they are physically alone. And people are lonely online. A lot of right-wingers on Twitter admit to never going out. Paul Joseph Watson has 650,000 followers, yet has said he never leaves the house, so his observations on society are based simply on memes, Freeview, and watching his body's fungal spores at war. One thing revealed by the internet is that the propaganda model has a weakness. It lacks variety. Social media could destroy mainstream news sources, but it's surely far more likely, given their relative resources, that it will be co-opted into providing a broader spectrum of conformity. Newspapers and television are, after all, produced by people with budgets. The internet response is produced by hopeful bloggers eating pound shop custard from the tin. In which the author returns from a holiday staying beside Trump Tower and is troubled. February 2017. America has gone from the Obama years to the Trump years, like going from the West Wing to a sitcom where the incidental music involves a tuba. I actually think Trump is going to prove a lot of people wrong, but sadly not George Orwell, Margaret Atwood, or whoever wrote the Book of Revelation. It says a lot about the man that building a giant wall isn't even in the top 5 most Game of Thrones things about him. Of course, presidents always enter office with something to prove. It's just rarely their sanity. You look into Trump's eyes and you see the fear and confusion of a man who's just been told that he's got stage 4 cervical cancer. He's a supervillain in a world without heroes, a man so obnoxious and unhappy that karma may see him reincarnated as himself. It's still difficult to classify him exactly. He's not a classic Nazi, but would burn books if his supporters knew how to read. Clinton was obviously the preferred establishment candidate, and whoever was on the rota for this election cycle at the Illuminati really dropped the ball. But Trump is still very much someone the permanent powers have assessed that they can work with. That's the reason he hasn't simply been assassinated. That and the fear that if someone blew his brains out, he'd just keep talking. One of his first acts as president was an executive order to ban federal money going to international groups which perform or provide information on abortions, making it clear that he'll only provide billion-dollar funding to terminate young lives overseas if some kind of US-made drone is involved. This bill stops funding for birth control in countries where religion and culture mean women have no access to alcohol. Think it through. Have you any idea how hard it is inducing a miscarriage just by drinking tonic? Call me a cynic, but when male politicians defund reproductive health centres, I always wonder how many abortions they've funded themselves. This is probably the revenge for some clinic in the 1980s rejecting their idea for a loyalty card scheme. There's probably business pressure behind this bill too. Maybe American corporations are worried that fewer kids in the developing world means no one to do the detailed stitching on their clothing lines. I suppose everybody's politics are shaped by the particular bubble they live in. Trump sees anti-choice arguments all the time. The only time he sees an argument for abortion is in a mirror. Trump cares about the same things a rapper cares about: women, money, and vengeance. Yet, random though it seems, his fight with the judiciary could well be tactical. He will blame them for the next act of terrorism that occurs, then declare a state of emergency, where everybody has to stay indoors while his tweets are read out over a tannoy. I'm in an unusual position in that I don't support Trump being invited to Britain, but I do hope he comes. Britain is divided at the moment, and nothing unites us like hating Americans. Britain is good at mockery, and it will hopefully be a bit like when David Blaine came and sat in that plastic box. Of course, Farage has gone full Lord Haw-Haw, correctly gauging that history wasn't going to judge him very kindly anyway, and that there might not be any. If the Queen ever has to shake Trump's hand, she'll put on so many gloves she'll look like Mickey Mouse. I find it amusing that the same people who think it's ridiculous for Mexico to be asked to pay for America's wall think it's fine for us to pay for Trident. My best guess at the great man's next move is the hoisting of an enormous burning eye above Trump Tower. It's a building for which the words tacky and gaudy somehow seem too jolly and frivolous. Close up it looks like the memory stick where some giant alien sex killer stores his worst atrocities, or a version of the black slab in 2001: A Space Odyssey, sent to restore our consciousness to the level of chimpanzees. Trapped inside, Melania Trump has a look I've never seen before. the eyes of someone waiting with increasing impatience for Stockholm Syndrome to set in. The look of a woman frantically trying to unlearn English, appalled to find that this only makes her understand her husband more clearly. Perhaps women trapped in marriages with monsters resort to plastic surgery so that it becomes easier to leave a wax head in their bed while they work on their tunnel at night. Perhaps the manicures are to hide the endless digging. Perhaps it's the secret of their figures. They're not dieting. They're eating those peanut butter and fried egg sandwiches Michael Phelps used to train on and spending their nights burrowing like a fucking gopher. You have to say it's surprising that, with so much to work with, the response from the Democratic establishment has been to suggest that Trump is a Russian spy. How could he possibly keep a secret? He almost never stops talking, seemingly delivering a live feed of his internal monologue, using national television appearances to ramble about murdering terrorist families and blurt out fantasies about torture. Admittedly, any expert psychologist will tell you that torture does work, but only if you first threaten them with bare electrical wires. I'm equally baffled that so much Democratic criticism focuses on his incompetence and instability. Competent, focused Nazis are absolutely the worst kind. Equally, I don't really understand commentators who say it's vital not to normalise any of Trump's actions. They've been normalised for 8 years by Obama, while many of the same people look the other way. Banks and corporations writing their own legislation, war by executive order, mass deportations, kill lists. It's all now as normal and American as earthquakes caused by fracked gases being ignited by burning abortion clinics. Of course, there is a moral difference in whether such actions are performed by a Harvard-educated constitutional law professor or a gibbering moron, and the distinction goes in Trump's favour. That's not to say Trump won't plumb profound new depths of awfulness, like the disbanding of the Environmental Protection Agency set up by hippie, libtard snowflake Richard Nixon. Obviously, the most important issue here is why America hasn't done as well as in the past at capitalising on these horrors to create good music about the political turmoil. I mean, where is their Bob Dylan? Where are their anthems about drone warfare killing innocent civilians? Instead, we've got Drake begging women via song to text him back after a fight at the Cheesecake Factory. Britain seems to be in an even deeper cultural torpor. Everything from teen Vogue to young adult fiction has a more radical take than our press, and the Trump administration is satirised by American television with a venom that the British television industry, for its own government, does its best to avoid. Trump is at war with Saturday Night Live. He thinks it's horrible and yet he can't stop watching. Pretty much the same as how the world feels about him. How can he expect to escape ridicule? Being on reality TV is the closest he ever got to reality. His children look like a teen movie about Wall Street vampires directed by Uday Hussein. He's cultivated a square face the shade of a banned food colouring and the muscle tone of a coma patient. He looks like aliens came to Earth and made a human costume after seeing one commercial for a car dealership. Really, he seems like the sort of person that a competent left-winger with a humane alternative offer should be able to beat at the next election. Sad, really, that the only way Bernie Sanders could return in 2020 is as a glass sliding about a Ouija board. During the campaign, Trump said he wanted to stop America from making foreign military interventions, possibly because he realised he'd need the army for suppressing the domestic population. Yet someone so media-obsessed can't help but realise that among all the gaffes and flack, his insane aggression towards China and Iran have escaped censure. The media and political establishment largely approve. They only fret that he doesn't take the same planet-threatening posture with Russia. War sells papers, television advertising and arms. It makes politicians feel important. It provides nationalism with clear enemies to define itself against. Despite all the other failures this administration promises, the US might finally be on time for a world war. So what do we do? I think first of all it's worth noting that under an authoritarian government, all protest will be vilified anyway. Even before Trump, people got very upset that quarterback Colin Kaepernick didn't stand during the national anthem. You'd think that would fall under the list of white people-approved forms of protest, along with leaving a voicemail for your senator kindly asking them to stop shooting black people in the street. Personally, I think there's limited value in moralising with or fact-checking regimes that don't care about morals or facts. In Britain, We also have an increasingly authoritarian government. We send them petitions telling them we don't want them reading our emails, which they presumably already know from reading our emails. We face a brief political period that, unchecked, will bring at least irreversible climate change and, at worst, nuclear war. Morally, I think you have to look at what you can do to change your own country first, as that's the bit you have most influence on. This is complicated in Britain, as we have a government that has undergone what is known in the business world as regulatory capture by corporate and financial interests, and is broadly speaking a vassal state of the US. What can we do practically to influence our government that would truly affect the Trump administration? Well, in a country supposedly filled with restored national pride, we could not renew Trident and refuse to be his missile base. That kind of strategic loss would damage him deeply. No amount of likes or memes or petitions can achieve this. Really, if we want to survive as a species, it's time for organised civil disobedience. It's time to stop writing to your MP. In which the author wonders whether Donald Trump just needs a job more suited to his evident skills. February 2017. Say what you like about Donald Trump, but he's already done things people said were impossible, like made Twitter worse. Looking back, the Harambe situation is the closest working model we have for a Trump presidency. Last week he gave the sort of press conference that in a movie would bring a weary superhero out of retirement. His answers were filled with pointless digressions and absurd sentence construction, like he was desperately trying to avoid the buzzer on some unfathomable new Radio 4 panel game. And yet I wonder if Trump isn't playing to his base quite effectively. Grievance is a key part of his appeal, and chaos may well just look like him butting heads with Washington insiders. His approval rating among Republicans was 84%, before he started what will no doubt be a series of rallies. Even Trump isn't stupid enough to think he's still fighting an election, so the assumption has to be he's trying to enthuse his base to create pressure for his agenda on Republicans in Congress. Trump's base are people who believe that the US is a country run by elites, enabled by mainstream media propaganda, which, awkwardly, it is. Distorted media has been around for as long as Rupert Murdoch. By the look of him, that would include telling Moses the commandments would go down much better if he took the third tablet and carved a pair of tits on it. I do feel for Rupert, not least the arthritic tadpoles that shuffle around in his scrotum, clutching their tiny hearts every time they hear Jerry's voice, muffled by his adult nappy. Trump isn't inventing public disillusionment with the news media, just as he hasn't invented their dissatisfaction with the fruits of globalisation. He has co-opted these grievances and followed the pattern of his whole life by bringing a lot of disparate stuff under the Trump brand. The loyalists Trump has appointed form a kind of intellectual wing of anti-intellectualism, but really they're pouring out of the gates of Mordor so fast it's hard to keep track of them all without some kind of bestiary. Steve Bannon, who has the name and face of a relegation-haunted Scottish football manager, agitates for a white supremacy that already exists. Ironic, really, that one of the main things his administration seems to have illustrated is that only black people are good at being president. Seemingly every day we have the unveiling of some new cabinet member who has stepped screaming into our dimension after being outwitted by a princess in a cautionary folktale. If Trump nominated his horse as a consul, it would be a blessed relief. The modern far right have a lot in common with jihadis in that their sexual desperation has been used to radicalise them online. The Brexit and Trump campaigns have been their training camps, the equivalent of a few weeks in some desert barracks, shooting an AK-47 into an old mattress. Imagine the adrenaline surge of feeling responsible for a huge election upset, and then they have to go back to normal life, a life where they look like Joseph Merrick carried a photograph of their face in his wallet as an appetite suppressant, where their mail-order bride heard who she was being delivered to and chewed off her toes just so she had something to block up the air holes in her crate. And so they channel their energy back into the trenches of hate that now pass for political discourse, to where they feel safe and newly empowered. There's never been a better time to be wrong. I sometimes think that the new right have arisen without warning. Then I remember that there were loads of warnings, but I just kept muting and blocking them all. In all the hilarity of Trump, in all the cluelessness of Brexit, in the sheer inchoate, transparent, head-shaking, What the fuck of it all? It's easy to forget that we are losing. We sign petitions while they sign executive orders, pass laws, remove regulation. We share pictures of them signing away our rights as caption competitions. And yes, I realise columns like this aren't any more effective. There's obviously a limit to the need for humorous metaphor when describing a society literally being run from a country club. The disillusioned electorate that voted for Trump are right to feel the establishment doesn't care about them. It rarely even considers them. The Democratic Party's response to Trump has had all the zip of an adulterous journalist phoning in coverage of a conference they didn't attend, and there isn't a war he could declare that they won't back. For Republicans, Trump's unpredictability is tolerated because his ideology largely overlaps their own. These are disaster capitalists, and Trump is their unnatural disaster. They look to adapt to and capitalise on the situation as they would try and find profit in any scenario, from hurricane to plague. Whatever happens next, it's certainly not going to be dull or survivable. Part 4. Meanwhile, in Britain, the EU referendum is happening. I think there's a mistaken belief that Brexit supporters are naive and have been misled. To engage with them, I think it's important to understand that they are reasonably clear about what they want and what getting it might entail. In some ways, austerity may have trained people for Brexit. Hard to threaten people with low growth and unemployment when that's all they can remember. I think most Brexit voters understand that it will make travel much harder and don't care. Just a casual observation based on the few Brexit voters I've met, but generally their xenophobia is definitely stronger than their desire to retrace Lord Byron's footsteps to the Temple of Poseidon. We won't get free healthcare in Europe. I'm sure Bulgarian families are rejoicing that they can take their children to A&E without having to shield them from a Scouser getting a stranger's tongue piercing removed from their foreskin. But there's also good news. Unemployment is falling as the amount of vacancies for hate crime advisors soar. Immigration has fallen anyway because Brexit has made the UK less attractive, in much the same way that if you want to stop cold collars, you fill your lawn with Union Jack waving gnomes and a frothing bulldog. Perhaps this is a natural endpoint of individualism. With a philosophy where people are told that it's their sense of self that's important, why wouldn't they distrust experts? Why wouldn't they look inside themselves for guidance? When we look inside ourselves, we tend to find not ideologies, but neuroses. Many people in Britain lately seem to have looked into their hearts and found little more than a dislike of hearing a conversation in another language, a hatred of women, a gnawing fear that they're being taken for a mug. And those get co-opted by real ideologues. Theresa May pursues Brexit because it represents an opportunity to forge a US trade deal broadly similar to TTIP and to stage a power grab at Westminster as it takes EU powers for itself. The Prime Minister doesn't actually care what the rate of immigration is. I mean, she does, in the same way that she has a view about whether she likes omelettes or not. But something so trivial as her actual opinion would never be allowed to affect policy. This misconception that the public are hardened ideologues, elites, picaresque figures motivated by petty rivalries is one of our society's propaganda positions. It's so powerful that when information comes in that contradicts it, it's simply disregarded. We're told that top Tories are constantly manoeuvring for the leadership of the party, but when it comes up for grabs, there isn't even an election. The idea that the truth would be broadcast, that someone would say, for example, Boris Johnson didn't stand for the Tory leadership because it would contradict his class interests and he would be destroyed by his own class, is simply unthinkable. In which the author reminds the listener that he was backing Corbyn in The Guardian like a legend. January 2016. Corbyn sounds like a dreadful town, dresses like a catalogue model for the Sue Ryder shop, and won't look significantly different when he's been dead for a week. It took him so long to bring out his reshuffle statement that people were counting his milk bottles. The Tories have been offering us a cocktail of incompetence and malice, and Labour haven't done anything to draw attention to it. It's been like watching Mehmet Ozil drop perfect crosses onto the head of an increasingly frustrated Stephen Hawking. Even Labour MPs must secretly wish they could stop knocking Corbyn and focus their attack on their real enemy, the party membership. And yet, who doesn't want to see Corbyn elected? Can you think of anything more ridiculous than a man of principle being inexplicably elected to high office? It'll be like a Peter Sellers movie. Sure, He'll be crushed under the heel of international finance, but I for one look forward to his glorious 6-day premiership. His brief reign will be a high point for modern Britain, a time that we will commemorate every year by leaving ironic poppies balanced on the lip of the missile crater where his house used to be, a time we will reminisce about fondly during the 5-minute socialisation breaks when they lower the dividing walls between our work cubes. This weekend's interview with Andrew Marr was, at least, refreshingly straightforward. Corbyn said he'd like to see talks with ISIS. Almost immediately, the Shadow Chancellor said he couldn't imagine anyone having talks with ISIS. I applaud Corbyn's aims, but at this stage, I'd like to see him open up a back channel of communication with his shadow cabinet. He said he'd keep Trident, but get rid of the nuclear warheads. This is classic Corbyn. He's using his experience from the allotment, and what he's saying is, let's put the nuclear weapons in the shed. He's not throwing them out, and he's not giving them away. He's putting them in a cardboard box and sticking them on the top shelf. We know where they are if we need them, but also they're up high, so no one's going to stumble across them and get hurt. He added that he cannot see circumstances where you would use nuclear weapons. Might I suggest he tunes into Lip Sync Battle on Channel 5? There's been a thread of coverage implying that Corbyn is a decent guy, but he clearly doesn't understand how the world works, ignoring the fact that for the majority of people, it doesn't. Corbyn is in a unique position. He knows that the media is trying to portray him as slightly mad, but can't mention this without sounding completely insane. Coverage is undoubtedly biased. Take, for example, the recent reshuffle, which forced the media to conclude that he was both weak and ruthless. Corbyn hiring more women than men was ignored, whereas Cameron hiring a 1/3 female cabinet was hailed as a triumph for feminism. In any case, feeling good about ourselves simply for allowing some kind of plurality in public life probably means that we're a fairly dreadful country. Canada has just appointed a cabinet 50% female, with Indigenous, Sikh and disabled members. And that's Canada, a country with all the daring forward thinking of a defrosting lasagna. Pat McFadden, a man who said government actions couldn't be blamed for angry marginalised groups, is still angrily shouting that it's unfair his party have marginalised him. McFadden was sacked for saying terrorists have 100% responsibility for their own actions and has since used his whinging, like some kind of high-pitched mating call to the news networks, to bemoan the fact that he's been held fully responsible for his actions. It feels like we currently know what every Labour MP thinks about everything. I know more about what each Labour MP thinks than I learn about next door's cat in an hour's phone call with my mother. Emily Thornbury seems a good appointment. At least she lives in the modern world. She's quote tweeting and using emojis, while her colleagues are desperately sexting in the search box. Really, Thornbury should be Shadow Minister for Youth, though I guess as Defence Minister she'll meet plenty of our young people as they career towards the Commons in ticking vests. The Labour Party has, from the beginning, been made up of diverse factions. That's its beauty. Asking it to become cohesive is like trying to find one shampoo that will care for the hair of everybody in Angelina Jolie's house. Until recently, Labour politicians have been scared to tell anyone their opinions, as they have had to have one that appealed to every single person in the country. Under Ed Miliband, the current manifesto would just say, "Good Adele's back, isn't it?" A certain nostalgia in the parliamentary party is inevitable. It's hard to deny Blair helped to create a powerful movement. Unfortunately, that movement was Islamic State. At some point, Corbyn will have to talk to Murdoch, and he ought to be wary. There's a reason we've not heard from the guy who threw a pie at him. Murdoch will have muttered, "I want him dealt with," ironically. Then by the time the chloroform wore off, he'd have had barely enough strength to pull back his quilt of congealing custard, crawl out of his pastry coffin, and burn his hands banging impotently on the inside of a giant oven door. Does Murdoch insist on meeting leaders in person so there's no record? I reckon with some it's to see if their pelt would make an acceptable rug. It's only Blair's lack of back hair that means in 20 years he won't be spread-eagled in front of a roaring fire, its flames reflected in his gleaming teeth, as Rupert's butler completes some 5-star foreplay and moves aside so his master can arthritically mount Jerry, his bones creaking like an armada as he thumbs in a penis bloodless as a veal calf, and no harder than the Sun Quick crossword. Attempting to sire another generation of media moguls, by squeezing out his sperm like stale toothpaste so his doctor can perform resuscitative heart massage on them individually with the aid of a microscope and the tip of a pin. Of course, the representation of Labour in corporate media is going to be everything David Cameron could hope for because he, Murdoch, and pretty much everybody they know works for the same boss, financial and corporate interests. Cameron is middle management and Murdoch is more senior, something high up in their PR department. Another problem for Corbyn is the intrinsic conservatism of the concision demanded by news shows. It's difficult to explain why an ingrained assumption is wrong in a soundbite, and it's to his credit that he can't seem to be bothered trying. Then there's the overwhelming lack of context in our news coverage. How many stories about the US's recent deal with Iran mention that the US overthrew the Iranian government in a 1953 CIA-backed coup? There's bias there. No doubt if Russia had sponsored a coup in Iran, it would have made it into the news coverage. But there's another reason this happens. Removing context makes it much easier to engage readers with emotions like surprise or outrage. Our news media instinctively removes context because, look at this inexplicable shit that just happened, sells more papers than the more depressing, look at this inevitable shit that will no doubt keep happening. Faced with this level of inherent bias, the rhetoric of anti-austerity is failing in a few ways. The first is that it tries to construct a persuasive moral argument against a case for austerity which hasn't been framed morally. It has been very effectively framed as a necessary evil. In any case, I've always found the idea of speaking truth to power faintly ridiculous. Powerful people are generally quite well aware of what they're doing and, should you ever make it past a security, will respond to your truth-speaking with a look that says, you don't know the half of it. The thing you can rely on about self-interested people is that they won't really be interested in you. They don't care, and you're not going to find the right form of words that suddenly makes them care. Another failure in left-wing rhetoric is that it imagines that decades of cultural programming can be undone by retweeting an empowering slogan. And there's a misunderstanding of the nature of the mainstream media, a stubborn belief among activists that something which serves a fairly rigid set of fixed interests might somehow be co-opted to serve their cause. There was a nice example of this in the referendum campaign, when Yes campaigners staged a protest outside BBC Scotland's headquarters about BBC bias, then complained when it wasn't shown on the news. It seems that increasingly, we all want to keep our message simple. It's like we've stopped grading ideas in terms of usefulness and moved on to shareability. Anyone explaining the Sun's role in British politics being primarily about influencing elections, while broadsheets are more often used to make the case for wars, will receive some kind of version of, but Murdoch's an arsehole, end of. And yes, he is an arsehole, but the exact type of arsehole is quite important. For example, I think Murdoch's position on climate change might be quite a significant thing to understand, especially as he recently bought the National Geographic, although possibly he just needed to own something that still showed tits. Rather than honing ideas until they are so simple they can fit into the little rectangles of social media, or standardising them to fit the assumptions of television, maybe we should all be talking about more sophisticated things face to face. It's no surprise to me that Syriza and Podemos consciously built social networks in food banks and other collective efforts. Possibly the row within the Labour Party is indicative of a general change, an old guard who see society as cohesive groups being replaced by a generation who see movements as individuals choosing to work together. After the general election, I doubted that anyone would have any hope left at all, any desire to put aside their differences to organise novel methods of resistance. One thing Corbyn's election showed is that there are a lot of people out there with hope. I very much doubt that it can survive the drafty meeting halls, cherished hatreds and bureaucracy of the Labour Party. In which the listener is asked to remember the Panama Papers scandal, May 2016. Perhaps we have all become too cynical. Why should we be suspicious of people who hide money deep within multiple shell companies on a tax haven island with the transparency of a lead-lined coffin? It's like being suspicious of your husband just because he's hidden a second mobile phone in a box of Maltesers in his gym bag, wrapped in an old dust sheet, in the car, in the space where the spare wheel should be. This scandal suggests some complex element in the British psyche, that knows this kind of thing is happening, but can't bear to be confronted with the knowledge. We know Cameron is filthy rich, he's wearing a 10 grand suit, but his sin is that he has forced us to think about it. Cameron has struggled to deal with the revelations, partly because he has no idea what normal is. I mean, none of us are certain really, but let's not forget that Dave once did a photo op where he tried to eat a hot dog with a knife and fork. The phrase, something like £30,000, is a phrase the man in the street can only tolerate being used so casually if it's describing the weekly wage of some journeyman left-back sex case that his club is after. One thing we've learned is that rich people aren't even rational. They can afford to live in the Cayman Islands and leave their money here. Instead, they make their money go on holiday so they can live in perpetual rain, like the way the dwarves in the Snow White movie kept all the diamonds and lived in the forest. Of course, there will be many in his parliamentary party who would be glad for Cameron to go, but not like this. If he goes because benefiting in some way from offshore funds is unacceptable, then literally none of them can replace him, and the party will have to be led by a picture of a bulldog for a while. A standard rhetorical pose on the left is that austerity is not economic but ideological. Is it an ideology? Isn't that giving a bit too much credibility to a philosophy that amounts to, I think we should take everybody else's stuff? Describing austerity as an ideology suggests that people like Osborne and Boris have a misguided faith in free market principles that is simply too pure for this cruel world, when they're actually 2 drinks away from burgling a charity box in a pub. I'll admit I watched Ian Duncan Smith on Andrew Marr after he resigned, and for the briefest moment thought I could see a certain passion, albeit misguided. I suppose I had a glimpse of how he and his supporters see him, as an almost heroic figure. But if a serial killer sees himself as being sent to rid the streets of prostitutes, we don't sit there and say, yes, I suppose he is a cleansing flame wielded by the Almighty, if you look at it from his point of view. Work assessments for people with Parkinson's and cerebral palsy isn't a different take on morality, it's immorality. It doesn't particularly matter what the rationalisation is. I sometimes wonder if austerity might be less of an ideology and more of a pathology. One of the reasons the Panama scandal is so damaging is that conservatism has positioned itself as moralist. There's a lot of talk about what's right and fair. In practice, this rightness and fairness is only seen as being something deserved by hard-working families who speak English. So there's an implicit rejection of the foundation of morality, universality. When you look at it like that, conservatives raging against human rights is actually completely consistent. They don't believe that everybody deserves what's right and fair, just those who conform to their idea of normal. And let's not forget, they have their ideas of normal forged in the public school system, a bloody crucible of hierarchical sodomy. Of course, they totally fuck over hard-working families who speak English as well, because once you've abandoned the key principle of morality, you've actually adopted a mindset quite close to that of a sociopath. I mean, we think of them as jolly millionaire malvivants, but they're much more dreadful than that. I'm ashamed to say that, at my worst, I think maybe hard-working, English-speaking families who voted for Cameron deserve what they get, because they chose to believe a serial killer when he told them that they were his favourite. In the old days, courtiers aped the style of the monarch. Modern politicians aspire to be like today's rulers, our corporate overlords. If you spend a sizable chunk of your career making sure corporations can take their money offshore, and hope to work for those companies later in your career with some title like non-executive director of thanks for all the favours, and if corporations actively court political influence through massive lobbying operations, then you will end up with a certain level of symbiosis. Also, let's not forget that the lobbyist's job is to mimic politicians, and the politicians are trying to promote themselves and their agendas to business. It's like Mad Men if there were no creatives and everybody was just in sales. Imagine the horrifying occasions where they bond. Drunken lunches, awards ceremonies, a black mass in the Cotswolds. In the end, as a senior politician, having spent a career in what is the PR wing of corporatism, offshore tax arrangements might well be one of the few things you know anything about. I mean that quite literally. Politics will be full of people who wouldn't know the price of a pint of milk but will understand the incorporation of a shell company. Why wouldn't they have a trust in Panama? Corporations may hire celebrity spokesmodels, personify themselves as mascots, and in the US demand that they have the constitutional rights of people, but they are not people. They are blueprints for making money, and they don't address their social obligations because they don't care. I suspect before long we'll see corporations donating to space exploration in the hope that they'll be able to take advantage of a 0% tax rate by screwing their company headquarters plaques to the surface of the moon. In a decade it'll be covered with so much tessellating brass it'll shimmer like a distant glitter ball through the gaps in the roofs of their employees' shacks. I should perhaps come clean and tell you that the worst holiday I've ever had was in the British Virgin Islands. There's so much money sloshing around that I saw seabirds stranded on the shores, collected by volunteers and taken to wildlife shelters, where skilled vets carefully removed the wads of cash clogging up their feathers. I saw a heron have enough rubles pulled from its wings to buy a decent family hatchback. I remember a pelican, its bill pouch stuffed to bursting, crumpled euros and untraceable yen spilling from its mouth like a stripper's thong. In a restaurant, for dessert, I was served a battered suitcase brimming over with 200 million euros worth of bearer shares. When I told the waiter that I'd ordered the creme brulee, he gave me a dry chuckle and said that he must have misheard. He let me keep the suitcase, saying that there was plenty more where that came from. At night, we gathered on a starlit veranda to watch the arrival of the cash. It's one of nature's most epic sights. First we heard the grunting, faint at first but then louder, until by just the accent alone we could almost tell the Russian from the Australian from the French. The sea began to foam, the frenzied activity just offshore. And then they landed, huge creatures, some as massive as an alpha walrus. Fat and breathing heavily, they heaved themselves onto the shore. Hundreds, if not thousands. Lawyers, drug lords, politicians, prime ministers, mafia members, businessmen, peers of the realm, sex offenders, and a cellist. Their bodies warm and fleshy. It had been a good summer. This mass of quivering corporate meat quickly made its way towards the dunes, dragging themselves forward, thinking only of themselves. Smaller, weaker animals were crushed, suffocated. Then in a hysterical free-for-all using hand, feet, snouts, they dig. Each of these secretive creatures digs its own filthy hole, and then, lumbering into position, lower their vent into the crater. It's then that they begin laying, firing into the golden sand wads of unmarked bills, fake invoices, untraceable companies, gold bullion. It takes but a moment, the animals moving quickly so as not to be exposed on the shore for any longer than necessary. Then, with feverish activity from their hindquarters, the hole is backfilled. Without so much as a fingerprint left in the sand, they shuffle, belly first, back towards the sea. They raise their heads to the moon and roar. It is a primeval sound, and one by one they all join in. Soon the waves crashing onto the beach are drowned out by the beasts. There is a final sight of them before they're drawn back into the black tide, anonymous and free. This is something that will happen forever, which scientists now estimate might be as little as 30 or 40 years. In which the reader is urged to remember that we need an NHS or our bodies will stop working. April 2016. One of the worst things for doctors must be that after 7 years of study and then another decade of continuing professional exams, patients come in telling them that they're wrong after spending 20 minutes on Google. So imagine how doctors must feel about Jeremy Hunt, who hasn't even had the decency to go on the internet. Consider how desperate these doctors are, so desperate that they want to talk to Jeremy Hunt. Even Hunt's wife would rather spend a sleepless 72 hours gazing into a cracked open rib cage than talk to him. Hunt won't speak to the doctors, even though doctors are the people who know how hospitals work. Hunt's only other job was founding Hot Courses magazine. His areas of expertise are how to bullet point a list and make dog grooming look like a viable career change. Of course, the strikers are saying this is about safety, not pay, as expecting to be paid a decent wage for a difficult and highly skilled job is now considered selfish. Surely expecting someone to work for free while people all around them are dying of cancer is only appropriate for the early stages of the X Factor. Sadly, Tories don't understand why someone would stay in a job for decency and love when their mother was never around long enough to find out what language the nanny spoke. The fact that Hunt wrote a book about how to dismantle the NHS makes him feel like a broad stroke and a heavy-handed satire. Even the name Jeremy Hunt is so redolent of upper-class brutality that it feels like he belongs in one of those Martin Amis books where working-class people are called things like Dave Rubbish and Billy Darts. No shade, Martin. I'm just a joke writer. I envy real writers. Their metaphors and similes taking off into the imagination sky like big birds or something. Indeed, he's so overtly ridiculous that Jeremy Hunt might be best thought of as a sort of rodeo clown, put there simply to distract the enraged public. I sympathise a little with Hunt. He was born into military aristocracy, a cousin of the Queen, went to Charterhouse, then Oxford, then into PR. Trying to get him to understand the life of an overworked student nurse is like trying to get an Amazonian tree frog to understand the plot of Blade Runner. Hunt doesn't understand the need to pay doctors. He's part of a ruling class that would happily scalpel out a prostitute's womb as part of a stag weekend. He comes from a section of society that don't understand that the desire to cut someone open and rearrange their internal organs can come from a desire to help others, and not just hereditary syphilis. The government believes that death rates are going up because doctors are lazy, rather than because we've started making disabled people work on building sites. Indeed, death rates in the NHS are going up, albeit largely amongst doctors. From the steel mines where child slaves gather surgical steel, all the way up to senior doctors working 36 hours on no sleep, the most healthy people in the NHS are actually the patients. This is before we get to plans for bursaries to be withdrawn from student nurses, so that we're now essentially asking them to pay to work. Student nurses are essential, not only as they're a vital part of staffing hospitals, they're usually the only people there able to smile at a dying patient without screaming, "Take me with you!" The real reason more people die at a weekend is that British people have to be really sick to stay in hospital at a weekend, as hospitals tend not to have a bar. We have a fairly low proportion of people who are doctors and don't plan to invest in training anymore, and are too racist to import them. So we're shuffling around the doctors we do have to the weekend, when not a lot of people are admitted, from the week, when it's busy. This is part of a conscious strategy to run the service down to a point where privatisation can be sold to the public as a way of improving things. Naturally, things won't actually be improved. They'll be sold on to something like Virgin Health. Virgin can't get the toilets to work on a train from Glasgow to London, so it's time we encourage them to branch out into something less challenging like transplant surgery. With the rate the NHS is being privatised, it won't be long before consultations will be by Skype with a doctor in Bangalore. Thank God we're raising a generation who are so comfortable getting naked online. I'm afraid it looks like you've had a stroke. Oh, no, my mistake. You're just buffering. When I was little, I was in hospital for a few days. The boy in the next bed was an officious little guy who took me on a tour of the ward. He'd sort of appointed himself as an auxiliary nurse and would help out around the place, tidying up the toys in the playroom and giving all the nurses a very formal good morning, which always made me laugh. I got jelly and ice cream one evening. I'd had my tonsils out, and they brought him some too. Afterwards he threw his spoon triumphantly into his plate and laughed till there were tears in his eyes. Then he tidied up and took our plates back to the trolley. What he meant by all this, we'd sit up at night talking and waiting for trains to go by in the distance, is that this was the first place he'd known any real kindness, and he wished to return it. For most of us, it will be the last place we know kindness. How sad that we have allowed it to fall into the hands of dreadful people who know no compassion, not even for themselves. Some thoughts on Trident, which the author lives near and may result in his agonising death. April 2016. I wrote a joke the other day along the lines of, "Our greatest fear is that we die alone, which is why I intend to take quite a few people with me. And it would be funnier, I suppose, if it didn't constitute Britain's actual policy on defence. It's hard to make a moral or strategic case for Trident, so its cheerleaders have resorted to metaphor. Trident, we're told, symbolises Britain's place in the world. Of course, I understand Cameron saying he thinks Britain is still a great country. Talking something up is a good way to get the best price when you're selling it. But we don't actually have much sense of history and don't really travel, so it seems odd that we're being told to spend hundreds of billions of pounds projecting a version of ourselves that we barely understand onto people we will never meet. Perhaps what Trident is really a symbol of is the era of late capitalism, where most things we buy are unnecessary to the point of ridiculousness. Persuading austerity Britain to spend billions on Trident is like convincing a tramp he needs a bazooka. What is the British way of life? What do we value? Daytime drinking, freedom of speech, for anyone who isn't joking, a big centre forward who can hold the ball up, making drunken sexual online threats to respected academics, hating people from a broadly similar town 30 miles away, watching strangers bake, watching someone we know fail, and whatever the opposite of reading a history book is. I'm not saying it's all bad. I'm just saying it doesn't justify heating up hundreds of millions of civilians to a temperature where their shadows catch fire. Perhaps we need to face up to the fact that Britain is becoming a sort of redneck country that doesn't give a shit about education or health, but needs to have the latest weapons. The renewal of Trident, casting Scotland as the wife who's given you one last chance, listening wearily to your story about how you've blown the benefits money on a new sniper rifle and booby-trapping the driveway. Cameron has eroded so many flood defences, it might just be an act of tactical military genius. Which of our enemies would expect a Trident submarine to be bobbing around a Morrison's car park in York? He has derided Jeremy Corbyn's idea of keeping the subs without missiles as patently ridiculous, and in no way comparable to building 2 huge aircraft carriers with no aircraft. Scaling down Trident might actually better suit our military requirements over the next century, as it has to be easier hauling 2 submarines through a desert rather than 4. Or maybe the subs could find a non-military role, becoming a place where we put Britain's worst sexual deviants, perhaps eventually replacing the Premiership. If we are wiped out in a nuclear war, the planet will need to be repopulated by the staff of the submarines, so the fact that they now let women serve could actually be seen as a deeply pessimistic move. The officers in charge of launching the missiles are trained to fire and forget. That's fire up to 160 nuclear warheads, and forget that the world has been reduced to a cursed sandscape where the strongest mutants will rule as petrol sheriffs. The government insists that we are prepared for cyber attack, but to be honest, we're rarely prepared for snow in winter. Having Trident, which genuinely has an operating system called Windows for Submarines, might almost be like a half-hearted suicide attempt. As for the supposed threat of North Korea, with their current missile delivery technology, it would take years for them to save up for the necessary stamps. Yes, they launched a satellite recently, but remember that it's much easier to hit a target that is basically the universe. I'm going to stick my neck out and say that people doing 8 hours of gymnastics a day while living on acorns aren't going to build a viable, targeted intercontinental missile. And if they do, it's going to be an absolute coupon buster if they decide to send it 3,000 miles to Britain rather than, just to pick a country at random, South Korea. Jeremy Corbyn said he would never launch nuclear weapons. He has commissioned a report into the renewal of Trident, and hopefully it will change his mind. It takes a truly humble and magnanimous man to say, well, I have to respect the decision of the committee, and if the occasion arises, I will now destroy all life on Earth. In any case, launching Trident is surely too big a responsibility for one person. The truly democratic method would be to have a giant button somewhere which can only be depressed by the weight of 51% of the population. Think of the fun we will have coming from all over the country to fire our missiles. Peace campaigners waving bed sheets with sad face emojis from motorway bridges at jeering megabuses of drunken pro-war monsters. Hordes of people living for days on the open Bakelite savannah of the button, waiting for their numbers to build. The cheer going up as they finally reach critical mass with the screeching arrival of the Chelsea team coach. It will be an event that the whole country will talk about forever, which will be a matter of a few minutes. In the final moments of life on Earth, someone will think of arranging their hands to make a shadow puppet, creating a dragon or a dove to be immortalised by the bomb. They'll know that nobody will ever see it, but they'll do it anyway. And this, I think, is what it's like to be any kind of artist these days, with no posterity to address, but still compelled, for reasons you don't understand, to work in the terrible now.